All about sources in Family Historian for beginners. This video will look at what are sources and why do we need them? What's the difference between a source and a source citation in Family Historian? Splitter Method 1 sources versus lumper Method 2 sources. Generic sources versus templated sources. And plain text versus rich text source transcriptions. I'm going to be mainly talking about Family Historian rather than Ancestral Sources in this video, but Ancestral Sources will be mentioned at various points in it. So what are sources and why do we need them? When I started researching my family history many years ago, I was just very keen to put all the information down as I found it. But what I didn't do was record where I'd found the information. I didn't record the sources. So now I'll often come across, say, a date of birth that I recorded, and I can't be sure where I found that from. Was that something that a relative told me? Did I find a certificate with that date on? Was it just something perhaps I'd found in a letter? Or was it something that another researcher sent me? And I can't always be certain whether that's accurate, how trustworthy it is. But if I'd recorded a source, I would be able to make a decision now as to whether I should be trying to find an alternative source for that, or whether the source was reliable enough to be able to assume that that date of birth is correct. So now I always make sure I'm recording the sources for the data that I record. In Family Historian, which we're looking at here, the sample project, we can show sources very easily by clicking on this yellow scroll icon at the top. And if I click on that, we get the yellow citation panel appearing. And if I click, for example, on Ian Stephen Munro's birth date here, the 5th of January 1953, we can see that the source for that is a General Record Office birth certificate for him that's been recorded. If we look at the marriage data there, which says it's the 12th of January 1986, if I click on that, we can see the source of that is a marriage certificate. If I double click on that citation there, we then get this pop-up box showing me the source and showing me if there'd been a transcript, there'd be some text from source there, but there is at least a link to an image of that marriage certificate there. Now this is John Appleton that I added with Ancestral Sources in one of my earlier videos, and if I look at the facts for John Appleton, we can see that he was born in Prescott around about 1845, and we can see down here in the citation panel that there are two sources for that, an 1851 source and an 1861 source that have basically led me to estimate that his date of birth was 1845. So I know that that's not entirely accurate. All I'm doing there is taking the word of the census and the age that was given in that, so that at least allows me to make a decision on how much I trust that date. The 30th of March 1851 is a census fact, and his occupation was scholar, and the source for both of those down here is the 1851 census, and again 1861 he was a cotton weaver in Wigan, and again there's a source for that. And if I double click on that source, that opens up so I can see the details of it. This is a templated source. We'll talk about templated sources later in this video. The text from source was recorded in Ancestral Sources, transcription of the census entry, and there's also a link to the media as well if I wanted to actually view the original data. If I close that and I go back to the 1851 census here, we can see the source of that one. That opens up. This is a generic source. We'll talk about generic sources later. And again, we've got the transcription from Ancestral Sources and a link to the media there. So hopefully you can see that it is important that we record the source for each of our pieces of data that we record into Family Historian, so that later on we know where that information's come from. It's also very useful if you ever pass your data on to somebody else, to another researcher, because then that allows them to make decisions about how trustworthy that data is likely to be based on the source that you have for the information you recorded. What's the difference between a source and a source citation in Family Historian? So for this example, we're looking at the source, which in this case is the 1851 census entry for Samuel Appleton's family. And for this example, I'm using what we call a method 1 source or a splitter source. And we'll be talking more about splitters and lumpers, method 1, method 2, very shortly. So this particular source has allowed me to create a number of different facts. So for Samuel Appleton, I've been able to create a census fact which says that on the 30th of March 1851 he was living in Wiston in Lancashire. And having created that fact, I want to link that fact back to the source of the information. And the link back between the information we record and a source is called a citation. So the citation identifies the source of the information that we're recording. So the source of the census fact we've just created is this Wiston source over here, and so the citation is just the link between the information we record and the source. The occupation fact that we create, because he was a joiner on that day, is linked back to the source via a citation. The fact that we could estimate his date of birth as 1813 in Prescott, Lancashire, came from this source, so it's linked with a citation. Mary Ann Oldham was referred to, and she has a census fact which we record, and again there's a citation. And the same for her estimated birth as being in 1813 in Liverpool, Lancashire. We got that information from this source, so we create a link to it via a citation. And we do the same for each of their children and the various facts that we were able to create for them. Like that. And it would be the same for other children that they had as well in that entry. Now, one of the key things in Family Historian is that we can record data obviously in the source itself, and we can also record data within the actual citations that we have recorded here. Now, because this is a method 1 source, which we'll be talking about shortly, I'm not really recording any data in the citation. The citation is purely just a link between the fact, where I do store information, and the source, where I store information. So the citation is really just a very kind of dumb, simple link between them. But if I was using a method 2 lumper source here, then I'd hardly have any data at all stored in the source, and all of my information would be recorded within the citations. Let's take a look at what this looks like in Family Historian. And so looking at Samuel Appleton here, if we click on his 1851 census fact, we can see the citation there, linking it back to the Wiston 1851 census. And if I double click on that, we can see in the top part of this screen, this is the information we have recorded about the source. And then underneath here are some boxes where we could record information about the citation. But as I said, because I'm using the method 1 splitter source type, I don't tend to put very much information in there. But if I was to record data in here, if for example I was to make a note in here, this is a note, that is only recorded in the citation that links Samuel Appleton's census fact to the source record. So whereas this data at the top is about the one source that I've got there, this is specific, this note here is specific to the link between Samuel Appleton's census fact and this source. So if I close this and have a look at his occupation, which also has a citation back to the same census source, if I double click on that, we can see we've got the same source up here, but the citation for the occupation linking to that source is blank. So if I put in some more data into this citation and say this is a note for the occupation, then we'll be able to see that if I close that, and if I go back to that census fact we looked at a moment ago and look at the citation, we can see that for that one, it has that note, but for the occupation, it's got the other note. So each citation is specific to the fact or the information that is being linked to the source. And if we have a look now at, say, the birth, which has a couple of citations, if I look at that, again, we can see we've got the source there, and it's got the text from source and the media, but the citation details, again, are blank because that's how I record things. I leave the citation blank. Arguably, the most useful thing perhaps in the citation is the assessment, and some people do like to record whether or not the citation is reliable, questionable, secondary, primary information. There are more options that you can use for that as well. It's questionable, direct, indirect, and so on. Splitter, method 1 sources, versus lumper, method 2 sources. So back to the example that we looked at before for Samuel Appleton's family. This is an example of what we would call a splitter or method 1 source. What this means is that we have a source for every, in this case, every census household. We'd have a source for every birth certificate. We'd have a source for every death certificate, a source for every marriage, etc. And when I created Ancestral Sources, I called that recording method 1. So the key concept with splitter method 1 sources is that all of the data about the source is recorded within the source itself. So we have over here on the right hand side the title of the source, Census 1851, Whiston, Lancashire, and the reference, etc. And we have a transcription of that source record. But the important crucial thing is that data is only recorded once in the family historian file. Typically in a method 1 source, a splitter source, we have no data recorded within the citation itself, or very, very little. So there'll be lots and lots of citations as this source is referenced by various facts throughout the file. This is an example of another census splitter method 1 source for a different family in 1851, Bryanston in Dorset, Thomas Cook's family. And again, Thomas Cook and his wife Susanna and their children have various census facts, occupations and birth facts with citations linking back to that particular entry. So looking at those together, we would therefore have, in this case, 2 different sources for each of the census households, and the various facts linked back to those sources via citations. Now, some people who have been used to using other family history software other than Family Historian, or have been trained and read read up on sources and citations don't particularly like this method. What they prefer is to have a source which is something like 1851 England and Wales. So rather than having lots of sources for each of the households, they would just have one source that covers all of the 1851 census entries that they find. And this is what we call a lumper source or method 2 source. So typically somebody who uses the method 2 lumper sources will have not very many source records compared to somebody who uses the splitter method 1 method. So looking at the same households that we looked at before, Samuel Appleton would have a census fact, and he would have a citation linking back to that 1851 England and Wales census. But now we need to record all of our information about that within the citation itself. So within the citation, we would have to record, for example, the census reference. And crucially, if I wanted to create a transcription of the census, I would need to record that within the citation too. So each citation that is created has that same data recorded in it for this household. So that's quite important as a concept to understand. We have to duplicate the same data multiple times. So within our file, we've recorded this census reference, in this case, 11 times. And so if, for example, we made a mistake when we entered that data, we would have to edit that data in 11 different places. And that's one of the reasons why I recommend, and other experienced users of Family Historian recommend, using the method 1 splitter sources instead, because you end up with this duplication of data if you're using method 2 sources. If we were recording a transcription of the census record, we'd have to put that into each of the citations, which is a lot of duplication of the same data throughout the file. And again, if you made a mistake in that transcription, you'd have to edit it in multiple places, or make a change in one place and copy and paste it into all of the others. Looking at the other household of Thomas Cook, again, we would have the citations, and we'd have to have the wherein source, the reference, recorded in each of the citations, and so on. And looking at those on one diagram, we've got that one source, and all of the Appleton family's facts link back with citations to that one source, and so do Thomas Cook's family. But all of the information about the references are recorded within the citation. So let's have a look at the splitter method 1 source type in Family Historian. So if I go over to the record window and look at sources, and I click on the 1851 Whiston, Lancashire source for Samuel Appleton, we can see the title of the source there, and in the publication info we've got the census reference recorded there, and we've got the text from source about the household, and we've got a link to the media for it. So the important thing is this information here, this transcription, is only recorded once in the file. So if I need to edit it, change it in any way, I can just edit it here, and I'll only have to edit it once. There's only one copy of it. Similarly, the 1861 census for their household in 1861, again, the data is just recorded once with a link to the media and a title and some other information. This is a templated source, so there's a bit more data in there. But crucially, the data is only recorded once, and the census and the other source records that we've got here can all be accessed very, very quickly. So typically, somebody who uses the method 1 splitter would have hundreds and hundreds of sources here, hundreds of census sources, hundreds of birth certificate sources, and so on. again, looking back at, say, Samuel Appleton and looking, or let's say look at Joseph Appleton and look at the facts for them. In 1851 there, they have a citation linking them back to the census source for 1851 for that household. And if I double click on that, we can see all that source data is there, the text from source, the media, but the citation details here are blank because we don't really have anything to store in there. When we go on to look next at the method 2 lumper source type, we'll find that we have much more data recorded within the citation itself. Now let's look at the lumper method 2 method of recording sources. So I have created an 1851 England and Wales census source and an 1861 as well. And so the first thing we'll see is that people who use the lumper sourcing will typically only have very, very few source records, perhaps one for every census year, whereas users who use method 1, the splitter source method, will have hundreds, thousands of census source records here, one for each household. If I click on the 1851 England and Wales census to view that, then over here we can see we've got a title, and I've also recorded a generic type that it's a census type of source. But there's nothing in the text from source, no notes, no media. So there's really very, very little information there. So this is really my first problem with using method 2 lumper sources, is how can I find all of the households, all of the different household records that are linked to this source? I can go up to view record links and I can see a list of people. Now there's only a very short list here, but if I had found hundreds of different census records for different families, I would literally have hundreds and hundreds of record links in here. And you just can't tell which of these are part of the same household. There's just no way of telling that. It may well be possible to do things via queries or plugins, etc., to be able to split up and find the families. But that's one of the problems with method 2. Certainly the way that Family Historian does it is that it's very, very difficult to get to the citations where the information is actually recorded. Now, one way we can do that is we can go to look at the individuals, and I can click, for example, on Mary Ann Oldham here. And if I go to her facts and we click on this 1851 census fact here, down here we can see there's a citation. And if I double click on that, it will now show me at the top here, there's the source we were looking at a moment ago, the 1851 England and Wales census source. And down here at the bottom is the citation for Mary Ann Oldham's census fact. And we've got recorded in there the census reference. Also within that citation is a transcript of the census, and there's also a link to the media. If we were to look at her occupation fact here, again, there is a citation, and we can see at the top again the 1851 source, and at the bottom the details of the census reference. And again, there is a transcription and a link to the media. But the transcript we're looking at here is not the same transcript that is stored in the other citation that she has for the census. We are duplicating the data. We have exactly the same reference recorded here as we had in the other citation. We're duplicating the transcript here as well. So for example, let's imagine that we found out that I'd made a mistake here and in fact she's not a painter. She's actually described as being a portrait painter. So I edit that here, and I'd like to also edit the transcript here because I'd like that to be accurate, so I should have made that say portrait painter. And that's great. But the problem is I have only edited this one citation here, this one copy. So if I now want to go and have a look at the census fact here and look at the citation, that still says painter. So I have got to edit that everywhere. And not only for Mary Ann, but each of the children and Samuel himself, the father. So if I go to Thomas here and I look at the citation there, again, it's another copy that I've got to edit. So we're going to have probably about 12 different copies of that transcript. So this is another problem that I have in Family Historian with using method 2, the lumper sources, is you end up with so much duplicated data, and it's a nightmare if anything ever has to be edited. So I'm hoping that you can see that although it might be a nice idea to use method 2, it's not going to work very well, and there's an awful lot of wasted duplication of data if we're going to be recording transcripts and also linking images as well. I do want to be clear though that there is definitely a place for method 2 lumper sourcing, and certainly I use it a lot myself in my family history research. It's really something that I would use for sources where I don't need to transcribe anything. I don't have images that need to be linked. I'm just purely needing to record where I got the information from, and very little more than that. So this is the sample family historian project, and they have here 3 lumper sources for the General Record Office birth, death and marriage indexes. And I have something very similar to this in my own file. Those sources really have nothing in them other than the title and the type. And if I look, for example, at Mary Ann Oldham here and her facts, down here I've recorded that she died in Q1 1888, and that's something that I got from the General Record Office death indexes, and she was 73, and I've recorded the place as the Stockport Registration District in Cheshire. I've not recorded it as Stockport because the registration district covers a wider area than just Stockport itself. And in the local note here I've recorded the reference for the death index reference, which is 8A65, so it's volume 8A, page 65. And I have just linked it back to that lumper source, the General Record Office death index there. So if we double click on that, there's the source. What I have done here just to illustrate is that you could put the reference in the where within citation. Personally, I don't tend to do that because I find it's a little bit harder to get to here. I've got to do an extra click onto the citation to see it, whereas if I instead just have it within the local note, I find it a bit easier to spot there. But that's obviously up to you how you decide to do that. As another example, here's Mary Alice Appleton, and if we look at her birth fact, currently we can see that she has a calculated date of birth as 1843, and we calculated that because, as we can see down here in the sources, the source for that birth is the 1851 and the 1861 census, where she was 7 and 17. So from that we calculated she was born in 1843. If I was to find a General Record Office birth index reference for her, that would be likely to be more accurate than a date of birth found from a census age, so I could change that. So I've just found that she was in Q4 1843. The place was recorded as being the Prescott Registration District, so I'm not going to bother changing that. And so in the notes I will just record that she was, the reference was volume 20, page 730. But then I just need to make sure I've recorded the source of that information. So I cite an existing source, and I will select the General Record Office birth index there as the source. And I won't bother recording anything within the citation, but as I say, you could, if you wanted to, record the reference in there. You might also decide to record an assessment, perhaps just to express whether you consider that to be perhaps secondary information. So I think really the point I would like to make is that method 2 definitely has its place. It's very, very useful, but in my opinion, if you are recording additional information such as a transcription of the source, or you're trying to link images, etc., I would tend to go towards using the splitter method 1 recording method there. Family Historian itself, I think, definitely encourages that as the way to go. Certainly with the templated sources, which were introduced with Family Historian 7, the templates for things like census entries and birth certificates, etc., are all set up as method 1 splitter source templates. And certainly if you're going to use Ancestral Sources, Ancestral Sources is definitely biased towards using the splitter method 1 source type. You can only use the templated sources, and you can only use the sort of rich text source types with method 1. But if you have a lot of time and you've had a lot of time invested in the past, and you've recorded a lot of data using method 2 already, and you don't want to change the way you do things, Ancestral Sources still can help you, but certainly some of the features won't really be available to you there. Generic sources versus templated sources. As you may well be aware, GEDCOM is a file transfer standard. It's a standard for transferring family history data, and Family Historian sort of very famously uses the GEDCOM as its file structure, and the generic source was the only option available in Family Historian until version 7. So for almost 20 years it was the only option available in Family Historian. And so a generic source is one which just uses the pure GEDCOM file structure definition for what a source can be. So there's an example here on the screen, and the only fields available to us to record about a source is a title, a type. We have fields for author, custom ID, a short title for a shorter version of the title if you wish, publication information, which I tend to use anyway for recording the sort of reference, the citation reference, and then there's a place to record the repository where the source is held. And then attached to that as well is the text from source, any additional notes, links to media. Now, this is the method that, the only method that was available to us was to use generic sources, and so a lot of us, me included, have created hundreds and hundreds and thousands of sources in this generic format. And so for me, I'm quite happy with it. It works well for me. But if I was starting out now, or if I had the energy to sort of start again and record the data again, I'd be tempted to start to look at the templated sources. One of the problems with the generic source here is that most of the information about the source you end up recording within the title. So I'm slotting into this title here that this is a Census 1851 source, that it's about a family in 1851 who were in Wiston in Lancashire. I'm putting the reference in there as well. I'm also putting in there the sort of key person, very often the head of household, in this case Samuel Appleton. But if I was to want to find all the sources that were for Wiston in Lancashire, I'd have to be doing a kind of a sophisticated search to search for any 1851 census records for Wiston in Lancashire. I'd have to be doing a substring search to be able to find that. If we look at the templated source, so templated sources were introduced in Family Historian 7, and they allow us to have a number of different fields, a number of different text boxes for different types of source record. So in this case, the template we've used here, you can see it says the template is the census return. So the census return template has all these various fields available to us. So we're able to record that the region is England, the year is 1861, it's in Wigan, Lancashire. We can put the address as well, who the head of household was, a reference, the repositories in there. This has come from Ancestry, and there's the URL, the web address for Ancestry. So it just allows us to have a much more structured reference for our source, rather than having to try and structure it in some way within the title of the source. There is a title for the source, we can see it at the top, but that title is typically automatically generated for us using the template. So the title is built up from the individual fields that are here. So it's still useful, but we can do lots of really nice querying if we wanted to find, for example, any sources which reference Wigan in Lancashire in 1861. It's much quicker to find that information. We do still have the text from source, the notes, the media, but it's particularly this sort of first page, if you like, which is the difference between a generic and a templated source. Let's take a look at the source types in Family Historian. So I'm looking here on the record window at the Sources tab, and we've got the list of sources here. So there's a column, this is in Family Historian 7, there's a column which says template, and so actually looking at this column I can see that all of these source types here are all generic, but we do have templated sources for this source, and this one. So if we look at that 1861 source, it's over here on the right hand side, and that's the same thing that I just showed previously. And for, say, this record here, this is a parish register, a church register template for the baptism of Thomas Appleton, and so we have again here various fields available for us when we are creating a source for a baptism or a burial or a marriage in a church. And so we can see it's very well structured there. If we were to look at a generic source for a marriage, so here's a marriage of John Appleton, all of the information really is within the source title there. So we don't have the kind of nice structure that we have in place if we're using the templated sources. We do still have the text from source here, so we've got a nice transcript of the marriage there, which was generated by Ancestral Sources, and we've got the link to the media as well. And if we look back at that baptism for Thomas Appleton, which was the templated source, again, we do still have the text from source, which has got the Ancestral Sources transcription here, and also the link to the media. So those things don't change, they're the same. We can still record transcripts in the same way, but the templated source gives us all these extra fields that we can use to record the data. And just to be clear, Ancestral Sources does fully support the use of templated sources. You just need to go to Tools and Options, and then tick the Use Templated Sources checkbox there, and then you'll see an Edit Templated Source link appear up there. And as you begin to fill in your entry, so if we just record that this baptism took place at St Thomas's Church in Stockton Heath, and we'll just randomly select somebody. So we'll say that Ian Anderson was baptised there, and he was baptised on the 1st of January 1890. If I click on the Edit Templated Source here, a lot of these fields then start to get filled in for you. I'd need to select that this was a parish register, but the fact it's a baptism, Ian Anderson's name, the date, the church, the location, etc. all gets filled in for you. The repository would get filled in as well if you selected the repository, and the reference would as well if you entered the reference ID. The only things you would really need to fill in here would be the collection and the URL. So if you do want to press on with using templated sources, Ancestral Sources will happily support that for you. There are also tools within Ancestral Sources for converting your census generic sources into templated census sources if you wish. There are two videos that you could watch. There's one which explains how to create the templated sources in Ancestral Sources, and there is another one which talks about the conversion tools as well. So you'll see those in the Ancestral Sources channel on YouTube. And finally, plain text versus rich text. We're talking here about transcribing data, and prior to Family Historian 7 and Ancestral Sources 7, the only option available to us was plain text. And by plain text, I mean all we could use were letters, digits, characters. We could perhaps attempt a little bit of formatting by putting in extra spaces or using tabs, but we couldn't be sure things would line up depending on fonts that we used and so on. So what you can see there is an example of a census source that I created in an earlier version of Ancestral Sources and Family Historian, where plain text was the only option available to us. So when Family Historian 7 came along and Ancestral Sources 7 to support that, suddenly we have available to us the option to use tables, so we can get our columns looking good and nicely lined up in census records, and we can also use colours and different sizes of font, and we can also put in hyperlinks to link to individuals within the family history file. So looking again at the Family Historian sample project, we can see, for example, here the Commonwealth War Grave record for Richard Dowling, and that's just pure plain text. There's no formatting at all within that. Whereas if we look at, say, this burial in Stockton Heath here, that's used rich text so that we can make it look a little bit more like the original record, make the transcript a little bit more accurate. The same for this marriage here, the same for this census entry, and so on. If we click the little button alongside here, it brings up the editor within Family Historian, so that we can do things if we want to, like highlighting and changing colours and so on. And we also have these links here which we can click on to bring up the individuals. So I can click on Mary Ann Appleton and it brings up her record, Samuel, and so on. So now over in Ancestral Sources, I've recorded a baptism entry. I've just chosen some people at random and put in a date. And when I click down here on the auto button, I can see the auto text templates that are available to me for baptisms. And the ones that have got the R next to them are the rich text templates, and the ones that don't have the R are the plain text. So if I choose this Parish Registers 1813 onwards plain text auto text template, I get, as you can see, very much a plain text version of the data. If I click on the rich text version, then I get a much more attractive version of the data in there. And Ancestral Sources will allow you to edit that. I can do things like deleting the column there. I can change column widths and so on. If I click the text button here, we get a version of the similar to what you see in Family Historian, where we can edit the rich text. And we've got all the various buttons here. You'll see as well that Ancestral Sources, this is optional, but in Ancestral Sources it's created these links automatically to the people, so that when we view this in Family Historian, we can click those links and jump straight to their records. So it's quite powerful. Ancestral Sources is able to generate these rich text, source text transcriptions for you. I think the final thing really to say is that a downside to using the rich text is that this is something that is specific to Family Historian. The formatting it uses would not work in other family history packages. So if being able to transfer data to other programs is important to you, then you do need to consider whether or not rich text is the right choice for you. I know personally, if I ever need to change to another program, if Family Historian stopped being produced, I would need to develop tools to do the conversion for me, unless somebody else had done that. So I'm not too worried about that, because I know there will always be another way for me to transfer the data. But it's maybe something that you need to consider. The other slight downside, I think, which again doesn't worry me, but it can be a problem, is if you want to produce reports, for example, in Family Historian, some of these tables, particularly the ones for 20th century census records, can have a lot of columns and be too wide for the page, so they end up either getting truncated or a little bit squashed up. I have made some suggestions about how that could be improved, and it would be nice to think that a future update to Family Historian will improve that, but at the moment that's a slight downside. But there's no doubt that the rich text versions of the sources are far more attractive and look much more like the original information that you're trying to transcribe. That's the end of my look through how sources work in Family Historian. I've tried to be as balanced as I could be in terms of giving the pros and cons of different methods, although I have, I think, also made it clear the methods which will work best with Ancestral Sources. And there are lots of different opinions out there about how things should be done. The Family Historian user group website quite often has discussion threads appear on the forums, which can end up being quite lengthy as different people give their differing viewpoints. But I hope you've found my trawl through sources in Family Historian useful.